Chapter I Closure. Let us begin with the ending. It is above all else urgent not to think of absolute spirit as a moment, whether historical or structural or even methodological. Absolute spirit cannot be considered as a terminus of any kind, without transforming the whole of phenomenology of spirit into a developmental narrative, one that can be characterized variously as teleological or cyclical, but which in either case is to be vigorously repudiated by modern, or at least by contemporary, thought of whatever persuasion. Is it, then, to be thought of as the final unveiling of the dialectic, a word Hegel uses very sparingly indeed, or perhaps as the definitive inauguration of something Hegel is much more frequently willing to call the speculative? These descriptions have their kernel of truth, insofar as the great movement from Verstand or understanding to Vernunphy or reason is grasped as a radical break with common sense empiricism and with what we may also call refi thinking. In the logic, however, the cancellation and transformation of Verstand, and this really may be considered an Aufhebung, is followed by not one but two moments, either of which might be called dialectical, albeit for somewhat different reasons. The second part of both logics, the greater logic of 1812 to 1816 as well as the smaller encyclopedia logic of 1817, is entitled Essence and deals with reflection or what we would call binary oppositions, in other words, very specifically what earns the term unity of opposites a dialectical matter indeed. The third or final part, however, that is devoted to the notion or biography is a more metaphysical, or speculative, affirmation of the ultimate unity of subject and object, of the I and the not I or nature, a unity that can take either the form of the syllogism or that of life. To what ultimately makes both of these kinds of thinking unsuitable candidates for constituting a whole new historical era or moment is the persistence of Verstand within them as the ongoing and inevitable thinking of everyday life and a material world. It is certain that Hegel is what might anachronistically be called an ideologist of the modern three, and that he thinks that a whole new conceptual and political practice characterizes his own period, whether one begins that with the French Revolution or Kant, or with Luther and the Reformation. But it is not so clear whether for Hegel the new post-revolutionary and constitutional populations have achieved truly dialectical enlightenment. The judgment is bound up with that of the status of his philosophy. Is it truly universal and exoteric, or rather an esoteric doctrine accessible only to the happy few? I would suggest that the turning point in Hegel's judgment on that status is to be located in his first teaching year in the Nuremberg Gymnasium, when he finds to his dismay that the phenomenology is not a satisfactory guide for his students after all, and concludes that philosophy cannot realistically be part of the high school curriculum as he once thought, a disillusionment that significantly coincides with Napoleon's defeat, and a new reactionary hegemony over Europe. For still, might not the chapter on absolute spirit signal a different kind of historical inauguration, that of the appearance of a new kind of human being here and there among the general population, if not the Nietzschean Superman, then at least what Kojève calls the sage, whom he goes so far as to identify with the Platonic philosopher king. 5. The momentary appearance of Napoleon on the world stage lends historical weight and interest to Kojève's interpretation. Yet it cannot be said that Hegel's conception of the world historical individual reinforces Kojève's anthropomorphism, inasmuch as the very idea of the ruse of reason or history devalues the individual great man by demonstrating that he is merely a pawn or a tool in the hands of historical development. Kojève's view here is akin to the temptation of personification in literary analysis and traditional allegory, and certainly goes against the grain of the contemporary theory anxious to decenter the subject and to invent collective or structural analyses for what used to be individualizing ones. Indeed, nothing in the final chapter of the Phenomenology suggests Hegel's complicity in the idea of the sage with which Kojève here endows him. But surely absolute spirit may be seen as a kind of method, in a chapter which systematically reviews all the moments of the phenomenology and characterizes their findings as truths for us and insights we have only been qualified to earn on the strength of reaching this final speculative conviction about the ultimate unity of subject and object. Yet the very concept of method flattens out all the properly dialectical differences between the chapters and screens out the stimulating heterogeneity of the phenomenology itself. The dialectic is not enhanced by its association with the truly vulgar and instrumental idea of method, a temptation we would do well to resist but which is certainly reinforced by the omnipresence of Verstand, or that refined thinking of which method is so striking an example. What may well prove more congenial to a contemporary or a postmodern public is the invocation of Marx's notion of general intellect, which has also been foundational for the Negri/Heart theory of the multitude. 6. Marx's expression, found in the Grundrisse, evokes an historically new kind of general literacy in the mass public, most strikingly evinced in the trickling down of scientific knowledge and technological know-how in the population at large, a transformation that might also be described in terms of the displacement of a peasant, or feudal, mentality by a more general urban one, and in hindsight also comprehensible as a fundamental consequence of literacy and mass culture. At any rate, the hypothesis of such a social transformation in consciousness and mentality, in spirit or Geist in Hegel's sense, is not at all incompatible with Hegel's narrative here, and it strengthens the renewed appeal of Hegel's work and the revival of interest in it, in a postmodernity characterized by cynical reason and by what I will later on term plebeianization. We must at any rate read absolute spirit as a symptom rather than a prophecy, and thereby rescue the phenomenology from its stereotypical reading as an out-of-date teleology. Indeed, in what follows I will argue that the ladder of forms of this work is as open-ended as one likes. How else to explain the persistence today of that opposition between left Hegelians, such as Kojève, and right Hegelians, Fukuyama, and the triumph of American capitalism, that had already declared itself in the struggle for his system immediately after Hegel's own death?